Good day, everyone. I am Ecclesiarch Rupert August.
And I am Fabricator General Henry.
I am the Holy Inquisitor's representative, Simon Burns.
I am the law! Also known as the Grand Provost Marshal, Kurtz.
Okay, good stuff. So, as may be inferred from these introductions, today we're going to be delving into the realm of Warhammer 40,000, or 40k. We are going to be discussing what kind of government the Imperium of Man actually, is. Because it's, I wouldn't say a hotly contested point online, but there are some things in there that might surprise you. So we're gonna talk it out.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, hotly contested. Most people would probably jump and say that the Imperium of Man is fascist, and that's understandable. It's authoritarian. It's got a massive amount of control over the information that is allowed to be shared amongst citizens, and of course their imagery is deeply linked with the imagery that was used by fascists of the 1930s and 40s. It's no mistake that the Imperial Aquila is undoubtedly shares a lot of features with Germany's Imperial Eagle, used by the Nazis.
But it's possibly also worth pointing out that the Starship Troopers series gets this treatment as well, which is also likewise unfair in that case. And I think what's being grasped onto there is the militarism aspect, not necessarily the political machinery that goes on behind it. Obviously, Sargon of Akkad has done some delving into that topic, and he described the Starship Troopers series or the Starship Troopers government as having something more like a muscular liberal policy, I think, something like that.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I believe Arch Warhammer has also spoken about how the Imperium of Man isn't necessarily fascist, because this is something that we've talked about in the past as well in previous podcasts, casual chats, is that the most people don't actually know what fascism is, so when they come to talk about it, they get a lot of points wrong, just because they're starting from a place of ignorance.
The thing to also understand about the sort of like confusion of fascist imagery as well is that a lot of it is pretty much directly lifted from the Roman Republic Empire, whatever you want to call them, just the Romans in general.
Yeah, again, and that's something that is carried forth into the Imperium. Certain fact, like specifically the Ultramarines, but the Imperium at large is again based on the Romans. I mean, the name alone, the Imperium, clearly linked to the Romans.
Okay, as you'll probably tell as we go through, Kurtz here is our resident authority on the Warhammer 40,000 lore, so we'll probably be deferring to him quite a lot. But without further ado, then let's get into it. So, I don't know if anybody just wants to take a rough stab at what their initial impression is of what the government is, and then we'll kind of refine it down a little bit later on as we go on. Anyone want to start?
Sure. So I personally am coming from this perspective of a relative normie or newbie, sorry, in terms of the lore of 40k. I tend to just play the tabletop a little bit, and Kurtz will not drone on, but he can talk for a while about it, and I tend to just sort of listen and go, So I think from my, I don't know, from my first impressions, the government of the Imperium specifically is obviously very, the word escapes me. It's very that word.
Authoritarian.
That's the one. But yeah. And obviously, as we were talking before the podcast, there's a heavy religious aspect to it. Anything to add?
Well, I'll quickly go over to my impression then, because to me the defining factor of the Imperium is that it is highly decentralized, and so what we get, particularly in terms of the the Emperor himself, who no longer has the ability to exert his will over the Imperium in a tangible way that he had before. I would call it something like a decentralized, semi-feudal regency council sort of thing. That would be what I'd go to.
Well, yeah, this is the thing. The Imperium's government by design is an absolute mess. It's marred in bureaucracy that has been added on top of it itself over and over and over, because as the history of the Imperium's gone on, it used to be just under the rule of the Emperor, and him being a god in human form was able to administrate all the laws and govern multiple different planets and provinces and lead war on account of his godlike abilities. And then the Horus Heresy happens, so then there's that great leader lost, and the control is divided up into less able individuals, and then all the Emperor's sons go missing. Then the Age of Apostasy happens, in which there's a massive bureaucratic error, which ends up, and basically as time goes on, more and more needs to be put in the way of stopping individuals from gaining huge amounts of power, because it just leads to destruction in the end. Which is why eventually the High Lords of Terror are formed as being a council of multiple different important organizations that make up the Imperium, who are then administrate things. And now in current 40k lore, even they have been pushed down the ladder, so to speak, by the return of Robert Guilliman, one of the Emperor's sons, who is now the regent of the Imperium.
All I was thinking of adding here as well is that one of the major things is you could argue that the Emperor of Mankind was very much a what would be, I guess, just a really militant atheist would probably be the best way to describe him. And yet, after his incarceration, I suppose, upon his golden throne, he was then deified, and weirdly enough, you could argue that the religion that spawned around him as being a literal god may have been what helped keep the Imperium together after the heresy.
Oh, yeah, that's a massive part. Like, part of the reason the ecclesiarchy, which is the organization that controls humanity's religion, is so important is because it does keep humanity in check.
Okay. With all the introductions set out now, then, if everyone's had their or given their take, where should we start in terms of where to actually start breaking this down? Then, because I think, what one piece of evidence that I would bring forth to start off with, and it's a little bit tangential at first, may seem anyway, but the fact that you have something like the realm of Ultramar, is it, and the Mechanicum, that are both effectively entities which are not sovereign but completely autonomous within the sphere of the Imperium, in return for them giving over some service to the wider Imperium.
I believe the reasoning for at least the Mechanicus is because they had kind of already started their own empire from on Mars in particular, and it was just a question of could the Emperor use is it really worth the manpower to try and take Mars, to try and take over a force that is technologically superior to you now? Or is it easier to just fold them into your existing empire and grant them as much autonomy as you're willing to allow while maintaining peace? As for the realm of Ultramar, I think Kurtz would be a better authority on that, just because that's to do with the autonomy of the Space Marines, and I'm not even entirely sure how that works myself.
So, before we move on to Ultramar, with the Mechanicus, obviously, like at the start, I believe it was that after the Emperor had reunified Earth, he joined up and joined forces with Mars in order to then go and reunite the rest of humanity. But is there much reason for them to stay autonomous now, or is it just because they've got like all the Titans or something?
They just happen, like the Mechanicum have a monopoly on technology in the Imperium. Right, everything from Titans and Baneblades and War Machines right down to handguns, it's all completely reliant on Mechanicum. In regards to the realm of Ultramar and the space, well, that when the Emperor was reunited with his son Robbie Gilliman, he had already started to conquer his own space empire, which was Ultramar, and it was basically just folded into the Imperium at large, and then watched over by Gilliman and his legion, the Ultramarines. And to extend this into talking about the Space Marine chapters, they are completely disconnected from the politics of the Imperium, to the extent where they don't actually answer to anyone. They have their own internal structure, where each chapter is about 1,000 Space Marines led by a chapter master, and they will act exclusively on his word. If a planet sets out a distress call asking for the aid of Space Marines, there is absolutely nothing, legally speaking, forcing the Space Marines to answer the call and go and help. The only reason they do respond and aid people planets who need it in the Imperium is because of a sort of sense of duty more so than anything else.
But who do they owe loyalty to in that case? So obviously each individual Space Marine owes loyalty to their chapter master and their chapter. I guess in theory the chapter masters owe loyalty to the Primarch if they're still alive. But who beyond that? Would it go directly to the Emperor, or is there some intervening body that they are theoretically loyal to, or are they just completely out on their own doing whatever they feel like?
Some of them are loyal directly to the Emperor. Some of them are loyal to their Primarch. Which is pretty hard, seeing as most of them are dead or missing. Some of them will swear fealty to the Mechanicum or to the Inquisition, or will swear to aid some other or to each other, so that they'll always form pacts or defense pacts where multiple chapters will act in each other's interest. But ultimately, there is nothing, legally speaking, binding them to any higher power than their own internal structure.
They're basically just politicking in their own way, which is more specifically they offer a service in exchange for something else. It's much like, for example, most chapters have a agreement with the Adeptus Mechanicus to give a tithe of gene seed to them, which will give them. And just long story short, gene seed is important to Space Marines. That's all you really need to know. But you give it to they get to give it to the Mechanicus, and the Mechanicus will then provide them with equipment and knowledge and training on how to use certain tanks and things like that. And that extends to also making pacts with planetary governors along the lines of, we will protect this planet as long as you let us recruit more Space Marines from your population, etc., etc.
So effectively, they're a non-partisan paramilitary.
Essentially, yes.
That is quite funny. Yeah, I mean, I guess it fits. Anything else that we want to cover on the Space Marines then, before we move on to another entity?
No, I feel like that pretty much covers everything important to know about the Space Marines as far as politics is concerned.
Okay. What about the structure of the? So somebody mentioned, I think, that the Imperium resembles a theocracy. So what about the ecclesiarchy? What's the administrative structure of that, and who are they beholden to? How centralized is it, etc., etc.? Actually, before that even, we could briefly touch on the Inquisition, because they're in a relatively similar position as the Space Marines in regards to having pretty much total freedom. Do they have any fealty to anyone in particular, or is it just the Emperor, or even is it the Emperor?
The Inquisition is supposed to be only beholden to the Emperor and nothing else, so they've got a ridiculous amount of autonomy. Even individual, the word of an Inquisitor is law. It's if they demand something, it is given to them, regardless of how outlandish it may be. Their internal structure is that there's 3 different ordos, Hereticus, Xenos, and Malleus, which deal with, well, heretics, aliens, and demons, respectively. And they themselves are constantly warring in between each other to get more power, arguing over which one will fall, what kind of investigations will fall under which ordo's site. It's one of those things where they are technically only beholden to the Emperor, and the Inquisition does have its own power structure, where it's got sort of trainees and then Inquisitors, and then Lord Inquisitors. But even then, it's the Inquisition is very messy sort of thing, where it's if an Inquisitor kills another Inquisitor of equal rank, it's sort of a weird thing of like, don't really know what to do, because all an Inquisitor needs to do something is his own word. So, yeah.
The other thing to note about the Inquisition and its ordos is the fact that there's actually more than those 3, but they're so minor it doesn't really matter. But where it gets incredibly messy is that a lot of these ordos differ quite a lot, like how Ordo Malleus is completely puritanical and rigid. It just will never accept anything that is heretical, demonic, or alien. Whereas I believe that the Ordo Xenos are more than willing to use alien technology if it's to their benefit. So they tend to like to hoard things, including demonic weapons, which, as you can imagine, makes the Ordo Malleus very happy.
Yeah, without getting too far into the lore side of this, I believe you were also asking about what the ecclesiarchy was like. The ecclesiarchy is essentially just a church, like the sort of like the Catholic Church, really. It's not necessarily tied to the government. It's just that they're certainly moving towards common goals. The Imperium at large wants its citizens to remain loyal and sedated, and the ecclesiarchy provides them with a religion that gives them a sense of duty.
The thing to note as well about the ecclesiarchy is that it did once, I believe, have its own standing army until after the Age of Apostasy, where it wasn't allowed to have it. But then they got around that through a technicality through the Adeptus Sororitas, where they couldn't have a... I've forgotten how it was worded, but basically...
It was said that never again will the ecclesiarchy bear arms. The men of the ecclesiarchy bear arms. So that's why that's why the women are the one bearing arms. It's another funny little loophole.
Yeah, it's very very bureaucratic. But okay, so quick question then. The Emperor is the ultimate form of sovereignty in the Imperium, correct? Nothing is above the Emperor?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And is there anything that is outside of the purview of the Emperor, or is the Emperor the top of all hierarchies within the Imperium?
On top of everything is the Emperor, yes. Underneath him is his sons, underneath them the High Lords, and then underneath them their own individual organizations.
Wait, so what's directly underneath him, did you say?
His own sons.
Okay.
The Primarchs. It's like Robbie Gilliman at the moment.
So would it be fair to call it a hereditary monarchy? Where the monarch themselves is temporarily indisposed, except that temporarily is for 10,000 years.
So that does make sense, I suppose, seeing as it is passed directly on to his sons. I mean, there was a period for most of 40k's existence. All of the Primarchs were either dead or missing, and Robbie Gilliman returning to the Imperium was something recent that happened at the beginning of 8th edition a few years ago. So it went from being controlled by the Emperor wholly, and then being passed on to the High Lords, and then once Gilliman returned, the High Lords passed power back to Gilliman.
Okay, so that would be a or the Regency Council in this scenario, ruling effectively on behalf of the Emperor, who can't exert his own will. But I guess determining the level of centralization that's going on, when it was just this Regency Council, say, or now that it's Reboot Gilliman who is in theory, at the head of the or the highest point of the hierarchy of the Imperium, and is able to actually, do things and exert his will. What would be things that he can't do, or can he just order anybody to do anything?
As far as I'm aware, the Gilliman is essentially speaking with the authority of the Emperor. The people of the Imperium would think of him as being either like a god or like a demigod. So what he says goes. There's nothing that's beyond his power.
The only thing to note, however, is that given how partly decentralized and even how schemy even the centralized parts of the Imperium are, not everyone accepts Gilliman, even though he is a bona fide son of the Emperor, just because, power and politics.
Yeah, so corruption is obviously a bit of a different thing, and organizational atrophy in a certain way, or internal power scheming and all that. But I suppose more specifically then, when we were talking earlier about things like or entities like the Space Marine chapters, would Reboot Gilliman be able to order any Space Marine chapter to do anything, and would they be forced to obey him, basically? Or, same question in regards to the Mechanicus.
I actually think the answer is no, but maybe Kurtz will disagree.
I was going to say I'm pretty sure the answer is no. Like, most Space Marines would follow him because of, again, a sense of duty, and that they're essentially like monks when they're not in combat. So they sort of live to serve the Imperium. So if the Gilliman did ask something of a Space Marine chapter, they would probably do it, but there are also probably Space Marine chapters that would just refuse to do as he says, in the same way that the Space Marine chapters would refuse to do something that an Inquisitor or a high-ranking Mechanicum member would ask of them, just because there's nothing literally forcing them to do so.
Yeah, so that was the question that I was trying to ask. Okay, so in theory, these entities do have a sort of semi-sovereignty outside of the purview of the Emperor's authority, which is delegated to Reboot Gilliman in this case. But I'm assuming in all of those situations the same would not apply if it was the Emperor himself, trying to exert that will. Would that be correct, as far as you know?
As far as I know, the Space Marine chapters of current 40k are a bit different from the legions of 30k, where the legions were directly controlled by their Primarch, and the Primarchs were directly controlled by the Emperor. Well, until Horus became War Master, that's a different story entirely. The modern Space Marine chapters, by design, are supposed to be as autonomous as possible, but again, it's that thing where a sense of duty would compel them more so than most of them worship the Emperor above all else. So, if he was to command something, they would probably answer it.
Okay, so from the highest down to I suppose now close to the lowest level, how much power can can entities like the Administratum, and if that's the right term, and just generally the central authority of the Imperium, how much power can they exert over, say, individual planets? And not only how much can they, but how much do they on a general sort of year-to-year basis?
Right. The Administratum is in control of most of humanity's military force, so the Imperial Guard, for example, and something that they would ask of a planet would be the Imperial Tide, which is just a request for manpower, which most planets hand over regularly and without a fight. They just fork over however many thousands of men or millions of men, this is 40k after all, may be requested of them. But I think that this is leading towards a discussion about how much autonomy individual planets have, and this is where the whole idea that the Imperium of Man is purely fascistic, it starts to break down, because individual planets sort of rule themselves. There's not even a centralized currency in the Imperium. I believe there's something called thrones that sort of act like, universal currency, but even then they don't work everywhere. It's because the Imperium is just so widespread and is trying to control just so many planets that it just cannot administrate that much all at once.
Right, yeah. So this is what I was getting onto, as to how much autonomy each individual planet has, and so basically, as long as the planet pays its tithe, and I'm assuming the planet is functionally the smallest unit the smallest administrative unit that the Imperium really cares about. I'm guessing it doesn't get any more granular than that. Correct?
It's probably about as close as the Imperium cares, from what I'm aware. Depending on how deep into the lore and how detailed the lore on any particular thing is, like, again, going back to the currency, one planet can have different currencies on different continents, much like we do in real life. So it is broken down a lot in individual cases, but as far as the Imperium is concerned, as long as a planet is paying the Imperial tithe, that's all they really care about.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so, and more or less the same thing applies to a lot of the other entities as well, as I recall. So, in terms of, as long as the Mechanicus is actually providing its service that it's sort of bound to provide, then not much more is going to be asked of them in a similar regard to the tithe.
So, is there much written in terms of the? So obviously, the planetary governors, for example, are free to do pretty much whatever they want. Is there much written about how much variety there is in like how they run things and how, like, the different government types that they implement, or is it sort of assumed that they're all operating under relatively similar codes of ethics and love of the emperor and such like that?
Not really. For the different planets can be at different stages of development. So there are some worlds in the Imperium which are hive worlds, which are basically covered in mountains made of cities with tens of billions of people living on them, which are sort of like what you'd imagine a sort of cyberpunk setting or a typical sci-fi setting to look like. Whereas others are feudal worlds, which are not much further past a sort of Roman sort of level of technology, and different planets will then have a different form of rule. Some of them have got a more modern system of governance, while others are ruled by feudal kings and emperors and so, as long as that they understand that they are underneath the Imperium of Man, that they only control their own planet, and it's again, there are as many different forms of government as there are planets in the Imperium, essentially.
I think you can also kind of get a general idea based on, because it's something that's more expanded in the Imperial Guard regiments that come from certain planets. So, for example, the regiment from Krieg is very much, I wouldn't even say them drafted, most of them are volunteers. They're just that eager to go out and fight, whereas other planets will employ like penal legions, basically.
Yeah, okay. But when we get down to something like the individual rights level, so how much freedom each individual person is going to have on each individual planet, that's, well, again, that goes back to, I'm assuming, the diversity of governance types and development levels of each planet and everything. So, presumably, the central government in particular does not really care too much what individuals do, and doesn't even seem to have the administrative capacity to moderate things to that degree until it becomes a problem, i.e. if there's some kind of heresy brewing. But other than that, it doesn't really care what any planet does, never mind an individual, as long as they are providing their tithe.
Yeah, spot on. That's exactly how it works. The Imperium doesn't care what a planet is doing as long as it's loyal and providing what it ought to be providing.
Okay, so that sounds like we can immediately rule out a centralized, totalitarian kind of state. because it does not possess neither the apparatus to be sort of totalitarian, nor seemingly the interest, really. Are we happy with that?
I'm okay with it. Just obviously, it's not something centralized. It's very unique to planet, be it Hive City, Forge World, etc.
Yeah, I'd accept that definition.
But in terms of I guess this is where it's going to get a little bit more difficult then. So if we were to try and divide it between a theocracy and a monarchy in the more traditional sense, I guess which entity between the ecclesiarchy and the administratum, I suppose, or the civil government, the secular government, like which of those two entities has primacy? Do we know?
What do you mean? Which one of them holds more power politically?
Well, which has the final say if we were to look at it in a sovereignty kind of terms?
Well, okay, this is something that comes back to the High Lords of Terror thing, where there would be a representative of the administratum and a representative of the ecclesiarchy, and it's a council that would have to come to a joint decision on something. So,
but neither of them could overrule the other.
No, I believe that decisions made by the council need to be not unanimous, but at least an overwhelming majority. They've finally got it out.
Okay. I don't. Okay. Would anybody like to forward another definition as to how we can make this a theocracy then? Because to me that rules out the idea that it could be a theocracy. It just sounds so much more like a secular, like a secular monarchy.
Again, without making this even messier, that was again when the High Lords were the top of the food chain. Now they are underneath Robert Gilliman and merely acting as an advisory council, just to muddy the waters further.
I mean, I would have called it a theocracy kind of before Gilliman's return, if just because it seemed quite clear that the teachings of the Emperor being a god had kind of permeated through everything, like to the point where, the Inquisition isn't just the Inquisition, it's the God Emperor's Holy Inquisition and things like that, where even like high lords within of things that are meant to be strictly not religious are themselves very religious. So I think that's where I was getting, maybe kind of tossing around the idea there might be a theocracy, just because even though it doesn't directly involve the ecclesiarchy, a lot of them are invested in it.
Yeah, a point that I think is very much worth noting is that the religion of the ecclesiarchy, the religion that worships the emperor as a god, isn't just... It's basically mandatory. If you are in the Imperium, you basically have to believe it. If you came out as an atheist in the Imperium, you'd be burnt for being a heretic.
Okay, so it's more just a fully permeated idea rather than a governing apparatus necessarily. Because to me, a theocracy requires an authority that comes beyond any single individual who is available at the moment, but has to be interpreted through either an established body or, well, I guess, or an individual, I suppose. So if you were to think about the papal state as a kind of theocracy, it is not that the papal state is ruled through the Pope per se, but that the Pope is the leading figure able to converse with God, and God rules the papal state. But that doesn't quite sound like the same sort of model that fits for the Imperium, particularly because the Emperor is himself somebody who is kind of present, and so there isn't quite so much of an ability. I don't know. Maybe stop me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem like there's quite so much of an ability for individuals to set themselves apart as the primary interpreter of the will of the Emperor, and thus someone who is able to give themselves additional power in a secular sense on the basis of their being much closer to the will of the Emperor. or being able to voice the will of the Emperor.
Ignorance here. I'm not entirely sure exactly how that element of the ecclesiarchy works in lore. It's there is certainly a head of the ecclesiarchy who is above all other members. I'm not sure of his power, his political power that is derived from his ability to commune with the Emperor, because the Emperor, though being essentially a corpse, is still able to communicate with humanity through psychic whispers, which are not really brought up all that often, actually.
Okay, fair enough. I guess that's just an answer we can't get to. So, okay, what else is there to cover? Unless you wanted to add something, Simon.
All I was going to say was that I was just going to basically withdraw my theory then of it being a theocracy, because I guess it just doesn't really meet the definition when you put it under such scrutiny, so that's cleared my mind on that part.
Okay, so it's not totalitarian, it's not centralized, it's not a theocracy. What else was there to cover? So, I mean, I think that alone, on the basis of it not being centralized and it not being not being totalitarian and not really having too much care outside of certain bounds what the individuals on the ground think, to me that's enough for it to not be fascist, despite kind of looking fascistic in places. It requires a reverence of the state that doesn't seem to be there, I would say. And a kind of all-encompassing of the state that doesn't seem to be there.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd certainly say that it's got a fascist aesthetic in more than just the way things look. It's certainly got the whole a reverence of the state. I suppose like soldiers, for example, are supposed to give their lives for the Imperium and the Emperor, but I suppose they're motivated by a sense of patriotism and faith. It's a weird one.
Yeah. I guess out of those two, then, which you'd have to ask which is the more dominant. Are you supposed to die for the Emperor, or are you supposed to die for the Imperium? But even then, that's not necessarily enough to qualify, because dying for Britain does not make Britain a fascist state.
I think what maybe contributes to, I guess, a misconception of the Imperium being like mistaken for a fascist state, and again, as we've covered in previous casual chats, where it's quite obvious that people really don't understand what fascism is. Basically, there is, as you say, they don't care about the individual, and that's maybe what sticks to people's minds the most, is that they don't care to a point of where, you know, a million, not even million, but billions of humans die daily, and it's just not really a blip on the radar to the Imperium at large.
I suppose another thing as well is that it doesn't have an idea of the... Yes, so, I mean, this feeds back into the totalitarianism idea that they don't seem to have an idea for a perfect or an ideal citizen, per se. It's more just... It doesn't stoop that low. The Imperium is more concerned with, I suppose, A, the Emperor, B, its own sort of structures, but C, more just humanity at large and protecting humanity at large, the pious elements of humanity at large anyway, against the exterior threats. It doesn't really have that idealized form of a man that it's trying to create and multiply. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I feel like we're falling into process of elimination here, which I feel is a good way of going about this. And I just thought, could you describe the Imperium as an aristocracy? I mean, each member of the Council of the High Lords is the absolute top of their field, and it would seem that they are there. At least, it would seem that they are there by merit on the face of it. So, could you call it rule by the best?
My problem with that would be that it's not that those aren't a sovereign entity unto themselves. They are borrowing their sovereignty from the Emperor. Again, because it's the wrinkle in this whole situation is that the Emperor is still around, and thus we don't get to see what would happen if you take the Emperor out of the equation. whether power then passes in a, like unilateral, untouched power, not just borrowing power on behalf of the Emperor or anything like that. It goes straight to some other entity. And so, would that just be... So, okay, for example, a hypothetical that we can't possibly answer, I would say, but it's an interesting thought experiment anyway. Had the Emperor died before any of the Primarchs were able to exert their will, or, revived or whatever, what happens to the Imperium after that? Does sovereignty defer to the High Lords, and then the High Lords become the sovereign entity, with the Primarchs just kind of existing as a separate entity? Or does it pass to a Primarch, which would then be, exercised? Then the power would be exercised on behalf of the High Lords again, instead of on behalf of the Emperor, on behalf of a Primarch instead, whoever is top of the line of succession. That would be probably how we'd have to determine whether or not it's like an oligarchy / aristocracy, or a monarchy, just with an extremely robust regency council and some succession problems, as it were.
You made me think that instead of it being like how in the UK we technically have a constitutional monarchy, we have this is an aristocratic monarchy or something like that. I know that's a bit of a butchered term, but you get what I...
Yeah. So, do we have any thoughts on that question, or that little thought experiment?
Well, judging by those definitions, I was just going to say I would lean towards the idea of it being what's the word? Like an absolute monarchy with, as you say, effectively permanent regency council. There's not really a lot you can do when the person that you would like to inherit the kingdom, as it were, from, or their empire from, don't know why I said kingdom, literally cannot die, or you're keeping him alive indefinitely.
Funnily enough, we have a relatively recent example of that kind of phenomenon in interwar Hungary, because Miklos Horthy set up a regency government, but I don't believe they ever did elect a new king, and so it was just a permanent state of regency exercised on behalf of a king that was never put in place, and there was kind of no real, to my knowledge anyway, there was no real sort of timestamp on when the regency would end, so it was just kind of a continuous thing in a state of limbo. And it seems to me that that's basically the situation that the Imperium is in.
Yeah, we'll never know what happens when the Emperor if the Emperor does die or is fully revived and returned to his full strength, because that would absolutely kill the setting, and then that would in turn kill the model sales. So Games Workshop is never going to do that.
Yeah, but we are kind of talking hypotheticals, and where it's one of those questions where even I'm really not so sure, because as much as it's an impossible because Games Workshop just won't do it, I'm not entirely sure exactly how the succession of power would work. I would imagine that would be in the best interest of the High Lords to be using their power as Regency Council. I don't think there's any way for them to have the power directly pass on to them without immediately causing more problems in the Imperium directly, especially considering the groups that are very autonomous in this situation being, the Space Marines, the Inquisition, and the Mechanicus. And you kind of need all three of those for the Imperium to even survive in the current climate.
Yeah, right, exactly. I suppose the one thing that they could do, though, to bring it back round to the theocracy idea, would be that they could take power and claim that they are still ruling in accordance with the whims of the God Emperor, even though the God Emperor is no longer alive, so they have to interpret his will from, beyond the grave kind of thing. But, that's getting into some strange territory. Again, it's a question we can't answer, but it's just an interesting way of thinking about it. But the fact that, as you say, we can't really imagine a situation where they could stably transfer power from the Emperor to themselves in the event of the death of the Emperor does sort of suggest to me that it's probably not a aristocracy in the sense of the aristocracy being a supreme sovereign entity.
Right, so at the end of all this, what do we think how can we best describe the Imperium of Man's government in that case.
Oh, just for a quick bit of housekeeping, it's definitely not a democracy. I think that speaks for itself.
So obvious we didn't even bother bringing it up.
Had to bring it up just for the sake of completeness, I suppose. I mean, I feel like the most bare basic answer is the Imperium of Man is an Imperium. It's an absolute monarchy. I don't really see how you could expand it beyond that.
It sounds absurd because it says it on the tin, but I suppose, yeah, just to have spent all this time talking it over and just to come to the conclusion that yes, it is indeed an Imperium. But no, more specifically, it is a monarchical, decentralized, almost perpetual regency council. I don't know, how do you express the idea that it's not totalitarian, anti-totalitarian, or just simply deals with its subjects at mostly an arm's length?
I mean, I feel like decentralized is enough to kind of explain that it's not totalitarian.
Yeah, you're right. I guess I can't really imagine a situation where you'd have a totalitarian, decentralized government. That's kind of a funny thought, but yeah.
So the best we can do is that it is a decentralized, absolute monarchy with a regency council.
There's not much else. Not much else to add, there really, is there? It's got sub-realms, which is probably also worth noting. It doesn't even have a currency, as you say, so it's certainly not a plutocracy. There is no rule by money because money is a non-factor. There's no universal transferable form of power in that regard. Then, and so power is expressly political and only political almost. It is entirely due to the relationships that you can engender with all of the engender and create and maintain with all of the various entities which act with relative autonomy to keep everything together.
The currency I can think of that's relevant to Terra or Earth is probably toasters for the Mechanica, so that's about.
Yes, give them their toaster quota, their toaster tithe, and they will grant you titans.
Toasters for Titans.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything that we haven't touched? None of these entities that form the central government are necessarily sovereign from one another, bar perhaps the Inquisition. But that just goes back to the idea that the Emperor is the only sovereign entity, and the only thing that unites the Imperium is service to the Emperor. Otherwise, there is no other government that can claim to represent the entirety of the Imperium.
I mean, I feel like maybe the entire point of this little casual chat wasn't so much to define what the Imperium is, but more what it isn't, because of how people both within the hobby and outside of the hobby seem to think it's fascistic or totalitarian, and I feel like in our own roundabout way we've kind of came to the conclusion of how it's not those things.
Right, yeah, exactly.
I mean, I suppose I understand the mistake that it seems that way at the macro scale, but when you focus in more and more, you realize how little that description fits the Imperium.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's probably somewhat created by the impression of, or the impression or view that we get, which is not, well, definitively not of the civilian side of the Imperium. We only really see the battlefield conduct where things are a lot more tightly regulated, because that's where the Imperium's energies are mostly focused. But there's a lot more to it than that.
You see, that is simply because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.
Yes, indeed.
Only war and sweat goblins.
And fungus. Lots and lots of fungus. But anyway.
More guardsmen than there are atoms in the universe, than there are still orcs.
Yep. Okay, well, I mean, this is already getting off track then, so is there anything else we want to cover before we leave it? Anything else that anyone wanted to bring up, or anything else that springs to mind that we haven't talked about?
I'm happy with what we've covered.
We haven't really talked about chaos at all, have we? Because that obviously has quite a big influence on how, uh, I suppose, how the Imperium runs itself. Just because it's got that constant external threat, do we think that that has any effect on, if not how they consider their citizens, or how they run it? What do you think?
Feel like that's going to take us way off topic of what we were supposed to be covering, which was just the government of the Imperium itself.
So no relevant effect, you think then?
Well, the Imperium are constantly at war with a dozen different enemies. Constantly. That is definitely affecting the way that it is governed. It's why human life is regarded with so little value in the Imperium, because they need to expend billions of human lives every day just to keep existing.
Well, it is worth pointing out insofar as it does so for the average citizen on the ground. The chaotic influence is essentially the one thing that would make the Imperium appear to be much more totalitarian than it is in most other instances, because again, that's the one thing that you can't do, the one road that you can't go down, because it puts the rest of the Imperium in so much danger. So it's useful in that sense, but other than that, talking about more of the specifics of how and the specific dynamics between all of the different chaos groups, I don't think is quite so useful. But yeah, it's important insofar as it does direct some of the attention of the Central Imperium, and in particular the Inquisition, of course, as we spoke about earlier.
I think to kind of maybe use it in a broad term, I think there are only really two threats. Pretty much all threats are external, or there is some form of external threat, but there are definitely two distinct threats to the Imperium of Man that can also not only be external but internal, like can cause absolute mayhem and havoc towards the internal working of individual planets to entire sectors, and that is both the influence of chaos, but also gene stealer cults, Tyranid incursions, basically. I do feel like they do definitely have an effect, because it does make it makes those governments themselves way more ruthless, because they're, if I'm a planetary governor and I kill 1 million humans to get rid of 10,000 gene stealers, it's worth it, just because of how absolutely detrimental to the planet those kind of forces are.
Yeah, this just comes back to the worthlessness of human life in the Imperium. Like, to stop the first Tyranid invasion in the First Tyrannic War, the best way the Inquisition figured out of doing it was just to destroy the Tyranids' food supply. So they just blew up a bunch of planets before the Tyranids could get their hands on them to starve them out. It just comes back to this sort of idea that in the Imperium of Man, the only thing that is truly inexhaustible and truly expendable is human life, just because there are so many humans that you can just discard of a couple of planet worth every now and then, and it isn't really going to affect your numbers in any significant way.
I wouldn't say so much that it's that human life is meaningless, it's just that if you start trying to look at these things in terms of how many lives it's going to cost, and you actually start to put not so much put value, but you start to really consider what the value of those lives is just not something you want. It's just going to hinder your ability to do the correct thing. It's very utilitarian. Needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, etc.
Yeah. Now we're back to treading more or less old ground, so I think we'll pretty much call it here. Goodbye then, everyone.